and that kind of thing. We will have time for questions at the end of both presentations, and then you can you'll be able to ask questions directly, or if you'd prefer, you can enter questions in the chat as we go, and we'll try to get all the questions addressed at the end. So I think that's all we need to do in terms of housekeeping items. And so we will get started. Our first presenter is Blair English. Blair grew up on a mixed farming operation in southwestern Manitoba and went on to complete an undergraduate degree in agriculture at the University of Manitoba. After graduation, he went on to manage a pedigreed seed farm for several years, and then embarked on a 30-plus year career with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, working as horticulture technician in the woody ornamentals unit at the Morden Research Center, a soil conservationist with the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration in the Alberta Peace Region, an agroforestry specialist located in Brandon, Manitoba, working in association with the Agroforestry Development Center in Indian Head. Blair is currently an agroforestry and agronomy specialist with the Science and Technology branch of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, located in Brandon, Manitoba, and also is the certified arborist that owns and operates Apex Arboriculture and Landscape Management Services. Blair will be delivering a presentation on shelter belt planning and establishment on behalf of the Alberta Woodlot Extension Society as a private consultant. All right, so take it away, Blair.
Thank you, Chris. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Jeff Renton for asking me to do this. Jeff is with Oz, the Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society, which is based in Alberta, and they specialize in forestry management and management of planting projects. And Jeff will be giving a little bit of an update on the 2 Billion Tree Program and a little bit more possibly about their organization following my presentation. So we'll get right into the presentation, and I'm going to be talking tonight about basics of shelter belt planning and how to successfully establish from scratch, and the principles, I guess, around that. And it's going to be time is a factor. It's going to be a little more abbreviated. Could be a lot more presented, but this is basically an overview that'll give you the basics. So we're going to discuss, or I'm going to discuss site assessment, the different types of shelter belts, some of their benefits, again, basic planning and design basics, how to prepare your site, some of the basics on planting, what you should be, how you should be treating your seedlings, different types of seedlings that you may have the option to plant, and looking at the overall maintenance and weed control once you plant, because it's, the work is only beginning once you plant. It's maintenance and ongoing work those first 3 years that's really critical to getting a successful establishment. So you got to ask yourself, what do I need? What do I want my shelter belt to provide me? What kind of services? You have to consider your site characteristics. What kind of soil, what kind of soil moisture retention capacity does that soil have? Predominant wind direction, types of vegetation for your area. If you have any animals, livestock that are going to be near your planting, you have to consider how you're going to deal with that, and any other obstacles. So things like roads, existing shelter belts and trees, any kind of utility or right of way, you want to make sure that you scope that out before and get permission, get the all clear before you do any kind of digging. And again, determine your prevailing wind direction. Predominantly it's, the north, northwest, kind of on the prairies is kind of the basic. How much space do you have available to put this planting? And, I guess, what type of soil is it, the type of trees you're going to plant suitable to the soil, type, you know, if you've got a heavy clay or is it sandy loam, what type of soil is it? And another critical thing to look at is what's the potential for future expansion. Like, are you going to be, you know, you don't think too small. If you've got a livestock operation or an active farming operation, you want to make sure that you plan big enough. So what is a shelter belt? Well, basically, it's any trees and shrubs that are planted in a linear format as a barrier to reduce wind speed and to manage snow in your area. You know, you want to minimize the amount of snow you have to get out or trap in your yard, so create less work. Types of shelter belts. So there's many different types, and I was told many of you maybe you're possibly acreage owners, but I'm sure we got some farmers in here too. So, you know, we got, you know, farmstead shelter belts, field shelter belts, and livestock shelter belts. I'm going to be mentioning them tonight, but I'm not going to go into any real detail on them. Just mention them here, but eco buffers and shelter belts for wildlife, very similar, just a little bit different in their design, but their basic overall characteristics are the same. Riparian buffers, roadside shelter belts, again, shelter belts for livestock, shelter belts for dugouts that you're going to be wanting if you want to trap water, if you need it for your livestock or possibly for, you know, an alternate water supply. So let's get right into farmstead shelter belts. So there's a, you know, basically a perfect design, a real design. I think this was somewhere in Saskatchewan, but it would, you know, the principle is the same for anywhere. So what are the benefits of a farmstead shelter belt? You know, you can end up pretty much, they did an experiment a number of years ago, identical buildings with and without shelter, and 5% saving. You're also producing wildlife habitat, you know, for pollinators, possibly for small mammals, and depending on the size and scope of your project, it could be benefiting, you know, corridor for larger mammals as well. Now, eco buffer is kind of a relatively new concept, sort of in the last 20 years. It was kind of taken from, you know, in Denmark. They started there with, you know, closely spaced rows, anywhere from 3 to 8 rows, and using mostly native species, and focus was mainly on creating wildlife habitat. So some of the benefits of eco buffers: they're going to protect your soil, help trap snow for moisture retention, create a microclimate, and again, increase biodiversity for pollinators, birds, and beneficial insects, and large mammals. Riparian buffer, basically, for those of you who don't maybe know what riparian is an area adjacent to water body, either, you know, stream, terminal streams, river, lakes. So it's going to end up providing or acting as a biofilter, you know, removing and sequestering nutrients. In the case of maybe planting willows as a planting there, that you would maybe harvest it and you could actually physically remove some of the sequestered nutrients that are being taken into the plant itself. And obviously for soil erosion stabilization on the stream bank and within the reach of the area. So the reach is kind of depending on the topography, it can vary from, you know, 25 to 30 feet to 100 feet, just depending on the nature of the area around the riparian zone. Roadside shelter belts. It's critical if you're going to plant trees near a road that you have them spaced properly from the road, or otherwise you're going to end up actually hindering your roads. You're going to end up trapping snow on there. So they need to be at least 150 feet away from the road. But in some areas where you've got large unsheltered distance, it really helps snow trapping on the road. So obviously you reduce the snow piling on the roadway as long as they're properly placed. Again, wildlife corridors for large mammals, small mammal wildlife, and again, pollinator habitat, birds, and other beneficial insects. Shelter belts for dugouts. You can see here, obviously you want the snow to pile in there and have it set up so that the water will run in. So you have it sort of landscape that you can take advantage of that snow trap and collect it. So obviously help fill the dugout. And again, same biodiversity, wildlife and pollinator benefits. So there's some other additional benefits. Like I mentioned already, the filtration, absorption of pollutants, but they also help with flood and drought mitigation, groundwater recharge, again, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration is a big item, and they can act as food and fuel, timber products, forage for livestock. If you're talking some of the smaller shrubs like red osier, dogwood, even willows, cattle will browse it. And again, I've mentioned before the beauty and visual barrier aspect. Yeah, so we'll get right into shelter belt planning and design and some of the basics on that. So steps involved in establishing a shelter belt, we want to come up with a good plan and design that's going to suit your site. So you got to, prepare the site, stock selection, species selection. How are you going to get it planted? And how are you going to maintain it through, what kind of weed control are you going to do? Are you going to put down mulches? Are you going to use plastic or, more natural, biodegradable? And just have a plan for maintenance and be able to handle the amount of trees that you're planting. So it's relatively easy to plant a large planting, but to take care of it is another thing. So something critical to think about. So like I mentioned earlier, review your present and your future needs if you can. If you got to think a little bit big. And of course, you may be limited by the size of your, if you're on an acreage, you only have so many square feet. So you got to optimize your space. So you got to decide on number of rows. You're going to plant 3 rows or 5 rows. What type of species? You want to have some diversity in there. And I'm going to recommend for anyone that needs technical assistance to consult with the Oz staff. And if you require any additional assistance following this presentation or in the weeks and months to come. So it's actually really relatively easy these days to, get an air photo of your property from either, Google Earth or, some of the provincial sites in agriculture have, you can query your land location and come up with a good aerial photo of your property. And this will help you come up with lengths of, pretty close within a few meters, until you do actual ground truthing and measuring it yourself. But it's a good starting point. So basically, like I was mentioning a couple slides ago, you want to establish if you want 3 rows, 4 or 5 rows, and what's the best placement of those to get the maximum effect of reducing the effects of the wind and snow management on your property. And it's also key to know, like, okay, if you're going to be planting or if you're going to be building any buildings in the future, that you want to have it so that you want to be at kind of a minimum of 100 feet away. So if you think of something, if you plant a hybrid poplar or something that ends up being 70 feet tall, or taller in some cases, maybe, you don't want these trees falling down on your building. So it's a good idea to have a buffer of 100 feet minimum from buildings, and any roadways, driveways, 150 feet. So this schematic just kind of shows, your protected zone, and so by having an L-shaped design, you're getting slightly more protection So yeah, depending on how you configure your trees. So just a little bit of a visual there. So the potential for wind reduction is the greatest in the 10 to 15 H, or that means like basically 10 times or 15 times the height of the tallest part of your shelter belt. So the wind will, properly placed, the wind will deflect up and over. And so you're minimizing that direct blast of the wind, but you get varying degrees of effect up to 30 times the height of those trees. And just showing a little schematic here just to show you want to keep your trees a safe distance from your house, shop, livestock shelters, anything like that. And in some cases, you may want to add what they call a trip line, like another shrub row outside of your shelter belt, if you really have large snow accumulations in your area, so that you don't have it all dump in your or accumulating in your main shelter belt. So it helps distribute the snow a little bit better. And as this slide shows, major accumulations occur on the leeward side, on the twice the height of the trees. So you don't want snow piling on buildings and accumulating to the point where you'd have to move it. You want more what's in the bottom right for a field situation. Excuse me. And you want to create multiple rows, not single rows. So here's a side profile of a basic 5-row belt, and now you can see on the bottom there, there's the numbers on the bottom part of the slide kind of show there's different options for, if you can go with a shrub row, 1 or 2 rows of like a deciduous like willow, poplar, maple, ash, or oak. But generally speaking, your 2 inside rows, or maybe 1 row on if you went with just row 4 and not row 5, your inner rows are usually your most dense, which are your conifers. So generally either the Colorado or white spruce, Scots pine, and possibly the larch. And you want to make sure, and as long as space allows, when you're planting small seedlings, the space looks like there's lots of space there, but when 5 years, 10 years down the road, you want to still be able to get down these alleyways to be able to maintain and get in there to control weeds, that kind of thing. So, between your shrub and deciduous trees, you want to maintain 16 feet inter-row between the rows, or like between the rows, and between the rows of deciduous tree and conifers, you want to maintain 20. But if you had another row of conifer, you could go back to the 16 spacing between the conifers themselves. And again, the intra row within the rows, you want to make sure you do give a proper spacing there too. And 12 feet seems like a lot for a conifer, but after 20 years and they're rubbing, you don't want them really rubbing on each other and causing injury to themselves. So it's good to have that plan on and have that figured out before you start trying to plant. So shelter belt density, basically your density increases as you move towards the inside of your shelter belt, the conifer being the inside, and the low one on the outside is more likely to be a shrub. So just listing some of the species here that are would be options for low, medium, and high. So what is shelter belt porosity? Well, basically it's the ratio of the perforated area to the total surface area exposed to the wind. So which is affected obviously by the density of your planting, the canopy distribution, whether you've got an airspace below the branch line or in the drip line, and what type of species you've got blended into the rows between multi-rows, and shelter belt width, number of rows, and the time of year. Obviously, if it's during the growing season, you've got leaves on, or how it's going to be a lower porosity in the fall when the leaves have disappeared. And here's just a visual, just to give you an idea of porosity. You can see that, so you get towards a 90% porous. Obviously, you've got a lot of airspace versus 10% porosity. You've got virtually no air spaces. So, and then the real life pictures there, you can see the varying degrees of porosity. So, you know, in a field shelter belt, you don't want it to be as dense in the wintertime. So you can see the bottom left photo there with the leaves off. Optimally, you're going to have the snow accumulated over a lot or larger area, not all piling into the tree row. So, you know, depending on the distribution of snow that you want, that's what you're going to design your planting to achieve that. So basically, don't make a wall. You want to make it ramp up so that you deflect that wind up and over. And again, here just kind of listing some of the species that would be options for those, you know, typical shrubs, chokecherry, buffalo berry, lilac, hedgerows. Deciduous can be anything from green ash. They're still kind of recommending them, you know, but there's a concern about ash borer, maybe possibly, and then it is in the eastern Canada and the eastern edge of Manitoba. But you know, if you have a diverse enough planting, you can incorporate some of those to have early on. And you could have a plan down the road that when they, you know, if you had to take them out, you can replace them, or you could, you know, if you have 5 rows and you have to take 1 row out and then replant it to something else, it gives you the option to do that where you've got a little bit of backup. And again, your conifer options are, you know, Colorado white spruce, Scots pine, lodgepole pine, jack pine. So site prep, very important. And I think my experience in the past is a lot of people think, you know, I've got, you know, the technology and equipment we have now, I can turn grass into a plantable site within a month or within weeks. But believe me, it's not, definitely don't want to go down that road. You know, especially if you've got rhizomatous grasses, you know, you want to be able to take the existing forage or plants that are growing there out and get bare soil and get it aerated a bit and loosened up so that you can give good rooting potential. So basically, it's good to start planting or preparing for planting a year prior. You know, again, I was talking about mechanical, like it could be tilling and disking, but I would recommend if you're dealing with, you know, sod or any kind of a grass or, you know, anything other than a worked field, you want to make sure that you probably burn it off with Roundup or something that's suitable to kill it before you till it, so you get good root kill. Remove any rocks, any other obstacles that might be impeding the rooting zone. And it'd be a good idea to stake it out unless you've got, you know, if you're not planting it yourself, or if you've got custom operators that have a GPS guidance system, well, then not necessarily is critical to have it well staked, but definitely want to have a start and finish point marked, and make sure you work a wide enough width so that you allow the whatever equipment that may need to go down there. If you're doing a large planting, if you need to use a plastic mulch applicator or a planter, you want it to be wide enough to accommodate that equipment. So why do we do it? Like I was mentioning, you know, the competition for light, nutrients, water, and space. So, and you want to, like I say, loosen up that soil. You want to kind of reduce the compaction that if it is fairly compacted site. Loosen up that rooting zone where you're planting your seedlings into. So sourcing stock. Typically, you know, you're looking at 1 or 2 year old plugs or bare root stock, possibly cuttings. But again, recommendations for nurseries in your region can be made by Oz. So I would follow up with them if you're unsure. So you're looking at anything from plugs. They're in the styro containers that are grown, or they're grown in styro containers in the upper left. Rooted cuttings, which were planted as cuttings and grown for a year and then lifted, or just straight cuttings that have been taken off off of willow or poplar tree in the spring of the year of planting, or caliper trees that have been lifted and have a root ball, or containerized stock. All these different types of seedling stock, you have to treat them a little bit different, obviously, and how you're going to plant them and get them in the ground. So again, planning and cost will come into it. So this is, for those of you who haven't seen a tree planter before, they haven't really changed much. The seats a little bit better than this now, maybe, but some of them are still the old seats. I'm not sure if the county of Vermilion or whatever has one, but custom planters will probably definitely have access to this type of equipment. So how do you want to treat your trees prior to planting? Well, you definitely, at the time of pickup, you don't want to leave them in a vehicle where they're going to heat. They get really hot. These are living entities, so got to treat them as such and don't want them to be basically cooked. Keep them in a cool place, in a shed, in the shade. Make sure that you don't expose them to the wind and sun. And if you have cuttings, only soak them 48 hours prior to planting in lukewarm water. And if they're bundled as bare root stock, don't just rip them apart. Try and separate them prior to going out into the field to plant them, and so that you're not damaging the roots too much. And again, keep them in a dark environment. Spray and mist them with moisture. So just don't leave them for an extended period of time unchecked, because they can dry out. So just spray them with moisture. Just keep them wet on the surface, wet. If they're rooted stock, you want to have them soaking only 4 hours prior to. A lot of people think, oh, put a rooted seedling in a pail of water for a couple days. Well, actually, the roots actually have to breathe, transpire, so they got to take in oxygen, so you can actually effectively drown them. So don't get carried away with soaking them in water. And storing, again, cool location. And if you're beyond 5 days of planting, consider healing them into a garden plot area or somewhere where you can, you actually keep them in the ground, and then remove them prior to planting. So take note of your tree delivery dates, plan accordingly, make sure that you're able to plant it in a timely manner from the time you receive your seedlings. If possible, try and plant on calm and cloudy days. When the sun's out hot, it doesn't take long for tree seedlings to effectively bake in the sun. So you want to keep them protected when you're out in the field planting. And again, so rooted stock no more than 4 hours. Spread the bare roots out and avoid J rooting. Now, by J rooting, I mean, if you're using a tree planter and you're putting the tree in and the end of the roots are curling up in a J shape, you don't want that. The tree probably will not survive past the growing season, because it's not going to be able to anchor itself and establish itself properly. And typically planting in May, early June, or similar to grain farming, you want the soil to be 10 degrees minimum. So keep an eye on that. So, and I kind of had mentioned this before, plant only as many trees as you can care for. Avoid any openings or access roads, or at least minimize them in your shelter belt. And if you do have to, plant accordingly as to where it is to least impact negatively impact your snow accumulations. definitely protect your shelter belts from livestock, i.e. fence them out. It doesn't take long for, horses or cattle. May pull those seedlings out. They'll actually bite on them or graze on them and then pull them out or just tromp them. And if you put down plastic mulch, it'll, they'll just put holes in that. So it's, for investing your time and money, you want to be able to exclude them. Try and include fruit bearing shrubs, to increase the diversity and enhance pollinator habitat. Sure, replacement trees are planted as soon as possible. You don't want to leave that to 3 years down the road that you decide you want to plant them. It's going to make it, it's better to have them all planted or maintaining that continuous planting. As soon as you have gaps in you've got weakness in your integrity of your shelter belt, and you end up creating areas where you're going to have basically the Venturi effect, where you get wind will gush in areas and open areas and come in and may pile snow in awkward ways in your yard or anyway. And again, the fastest growing tree is one that is well maintained. That's so what you put into it, you'll benefit. So as mentioned earlier, plastic mulch is an option. And again, maybe this equipment could be available in, and if not, if you're getting a custom done, they'll have access to mulch layers that reduces the weeding. It still doesn't eliminate it, but definitely gives your trees a fighting chance in those first 2 or 3 years to get a leg up on the competition. And I mentioned if you don't have a heavy wildlife traffic area, they will put holes in it. So, maybe something to consider. That might be something negative to not use that. And but you do need a specialized applicator. You can't really do this by hand. So there's that. And here's just a schematic showing kind of the, just how the plastic works. Basically, it heats the soil underneath a little bit. Enough doesn't hurt the tree seedling, but it actually will, negatively impact any shallow seeded seedlings of grass or cereal crops or anything like that. And moisture will wick underneath. Key is not to put the mulch on when if it is too dry. It takes longer for the moisture to wick up there, so it's better to have that laid when there's moisture in the rooting zone. And just another shot of a mulch applicator in action. And there's again. I think it's still pretty common to put this down, but definitely an option. Another option to plastic mulch is biodegradable. Hemp mats, biodegradable plastic mulch. I've never used that. I don't have any experience with that, but I'm not sure about the integrity of that. Might not be as good of an option as some, but also wood chips and straw options, particularly if you may have the option to get flax straw. Flax straw is a really good option, but other straws is critical. You have to get a critical mass there of depth and compacted depth to be effective. So weed control and maintenance. Obviously, everybody recognizes the good old hoe option, or using a cultivator or rotavator. I don't really like the idea of people running up and down, keeping their alleyways between their tree rows black. You're better off to plant something like sheep's fescue, something that's like a really short grass that's low maintenance, that you only have to mow maybe 2-3 times a year. But it's enough to compete with the weeds, but not overly competitive for nutrients and water with your trees. The danger of getting too close with any kind of mechanical equipment, you run the risk of root pruning, and actually you're just maybe impeding the growth, and actually maybe even taking or causing it to have an early demise. So if you're using a rotavator or cultivator, you want to be really careful how you're doing that, not getting too close to the root. So chemical maintenance options, basically any biocides in any form of herbicide or insecticide used in the treatment of tree diseases, weed control, insect issues, and I can't stress this enough unless you're like, have a lot of, if you're a farmer and have a lot of experience applying herbicides, I would advise that you get someone who's a licensed applicator and knows what is actually licensed as far as approved chemicals to use, because you don't want to cause more harm than good. Some people like to think they want to fertilize their trees, but this is something you may do later down the road, and especially not in the first few years of establishment generally, unless there's a critical shortage of a specific nutrient that you've identified through a soil analysis. There's no need to put fertilizers on usually. So usually applied via spraying or direct application on the tree, and it generally can be more effective by taking preventative measures to avoid having to do a full-blown chemical maintenance on your shelter belt or on any trees. So generally, there's usually other methods that can achieve the same effect. And problem with chemicals is that they're often non-discriminatory. Use approved herbicides. Here's a list of a few that are approved for shelter belts. There may be a few more now. Again, seek out a licensed applicator if you're not sure what you're doing, because you don't want to, again, devastate your investment by one simple wrong application of a wrong chemical that might terminate your trees or have a really negative impact on them. This is 2 sites planted the same year and relatively close proximity, same soils. The one on the left had virtually no weed control, a lot of perennial competition there of grasses. And the one on the bottom right has been looked after, and you can the visual difference is pretty impressive. So way more survival and growth by maintaining effectively your weeds, and you're just going to have a much more successful outcome. So again, protect your trees by fencing them out. Keep horses out, cattle out, or else you're going to have a bunch of holes where weeds are going to come through. And if you have areas where you have plastic mulch that has the wind has blown soil off, depending on the soil type you have, may have exposed an edge in high winds. It can start to increase from one little spot to a major blowout of your plastic. So you want to kind of check on your trees regularly in the first, especially in those first 2 years. You want to be checking on them, weekly or twice a week, depending on your proximity to the planting and how much time you have to allocate to that. And you may, if you have a lot of wildlife pressure, you may want to use 2-beck seeding shelters to avoid browsing. You may still get some top browsing, but at least if you can identify that before they take out the whole tree. They will grow in that for a few years, and gives you a chance to get ahead of some of the wildlife. And again, I was mentioning fertilizer, not necessarily necessary. And some mistakes sometimes people make is that they don't realize or forget that fertilizer they saved actually may have some other weed killing additive that's in there that might terminate your trees, and especially dicamba. And watering. You want to be in that first year, especially first 2 years, if it's not raining, you want to make sure that you're watering. Maybe it could be up to 2 times a week, depending on what type of soil you have, the soil retention capability of your soil. So you want to have the ability, and again, this is where you don't want to have too big a planting. You have to be able to have that ability to water it. So if you got too big of a planting and not enough equipment to do it, when you're not set up to do it, well, then you're going to be limited in being able to take care of those trees. You also want to kind of brush up a little bit. You don't have to be an entomologist or a specialist, but be able to notice if something's going on, if you've got some kind of a insect or pest that's targeting your trees, to be able to bring in someone that can identify it and help you correct that. And that's where Lloyd comes in. He's going to talk about these kind of issues. So, and again, the first 3 years are critical. Watering, and again, I mentioned fill in the gaps. Like if you had a gap like that, that would be a major problem, especially for a yard site. Like I said, you have that Venturi effect where you actually have wind tunnel and have some interesting things happen. And as your trees mature, you want to be maintaining, removing deadfall, dead and diseased parts of your trees, and again, replanting accordingly. So in summary, use air photos, look at your site, look at what you need. Visit a neighbor that has a good, what you consider to be a good shelter belt, and ask them some questions. How did you plant all this at once? How much did look at all the logistic aspects. Understand what can grow in your region. What are the limitations as far as species? Look at diversification options within what types of species that would enhance your planting for pollinators. And I can't stress enough the preparation. And again, you got to be prepared for your planting, be prepared for the post-planting and weed control and watering. And like I was mentioning earlier, visit your shelter belt at least once a week and look for any signs of something that's not right with it. Is it too dry, or you got, infestation of some sort of insect that's, eating up all the foliar leaves and just devastating them. So, you put all that time and effort into it and planning. You want to make sure you give it a fair shot at succeeding. That concludes my presentation. So yeah, take the step to contact the Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society, and Jeff, he will be giving you more information on that. Thank you very much. I'll just stop sharing.
Thanks, Blair. That was great. So I'll just be very, very quick. Just one thing we wanted to talk about was the 2 billion tree program that is being run through our organization. So as Blair mentioned, with Oz, we are an NGO, and so a lot of what we do is things like this. So we provide lots of training opportunities for landowners, land managers on shelter belt establishment, woodlot establishment management, and we also do a lot of tree planting projects throughout the province. And one of the really, really great opportunities that we have now is we are essentially a service provider for the 2 billion tree program across the prairie provinces. We call that the Western Coalition. So the 2 billion tree program is, it was developed by the federal government to facilitate the planting of 2 billion trees in Canada by 2031. And so as part of that, the government is partially funding through service providers such as ourselves, up to 50% for planting projects. And so that's a 50% cash contribution that's provided as a reimbursement. So kind of the way it would work is that we work with landowners, land managers, on building tree planting projects, or maybe they've built them themselves, and then we create a budget. And once that project is completed, we are able to provide 50% of the funding. So does that mean, if the landowner is doing it all, does that mean that they maybe don't have to pay for their seedlings, maybe some labor that's required, quite likely, or in other cases, if they have to hire people? Well, I'll get into that example in just a minute. So in terms of where that other 50% of funding comes from, so that can come from a number of sources. Often it could be cash from the landowner. Also, other municipalities that may have an ALICE program, such as Vermilion River, that is an opportunity to provide, the other portion of that 50%, but also in-kind support can be considered a funding source. So that could be labor towards maintenance, labor towards site prep, planting. So that's kind of just the details of where the money comes from. And in terms of how we support these programs, so like as mentioned, so we do a lot of training, but we also do provide planting services. So we have different streams of services that we work with landowners on. So there are times where we are just doing everything from the helping with the funding and the planning, supplying the seedlings, planting, and monitoring. Sometimes we do site prep and maintenance. Other times we do have a large quantity of seedlings that we order that we can allocate for projects. So we provide funding and seedlings. Or there's other times where landowners just want to go it themselves, and we just provide that 50% cash funding through the 2 billion tree program. So just re-emphasizing the steps that we can support on. We have a wide variety. I mean, we have a lot of experience with planning, and just jumping back on the funding, we work with municipalities on helping match those additional funding, other funding sources for the other planting projects. We wide diversity of seedlings that we generally order, and we have we have about a dozen years doing this on the planting side, and then we support on the monitoring, which can help inform what maintenance options are required. So just trying to be, sorry, I had to be really quick, but yeah, if there's any questions, the 2btree at ozab.ca email is how you can get a hold of more information on this program. And yeah, I'll let Blair take away answering the questions that I see in the chat. So thanks for listening.
Okay.
Actually, do we want to? Why don't we hold the questions all until the end, and then and we can move on to the next presentation, and then we'll just save those for the end. So thank you very much, Blair and Jeff, for that. There's lots of awesome information there, and like I said at the beginning, we are recording this, so it will be posted on our YouTube page eventually. So if you want to go back and check some of those things out, it'll be available. Yeah, so we'll just move on to our next presenter. Our next and last presenter, second presenter, is Lloyd Rumbold of Lloyd's Limb Services. So he is going to talk to us about tree issue identification, care and management, and some problem avoidance. And I know Lloyd spends a lot of his time these days up in the trees, so I'll let him do a bit more of an introduction as he goes. But we'll turn it over to Lloyd now.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, we got you. We can hear you.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for the intro, Chris. I think it'd be much to go on. I guess you're right. I spent a lot of time actively in the trees out there right now. We run a local tree service company, so days are long and little time is short. I apologize for not having a colorful presentation, but I'm going to feed off of everything I've seen there on Blair's presentation, and certainly it makes it a little bit easier for some of the things I see out there, and to talk about some of the same scenarios and all. The idea of tree issues, care, management, and problem avoidance, it's you can't talk about one thing without kind of getting onto a little bit of everything else. My background, I started in forestry management, and that goes back a few years anyway. From there, I found a lot of interest in residential tree care maintenance, and so as they say, it grows from there. Haha. Anyway, if I were to be asked about what kind of tree issues we see out there, it's a real broad spectrum of things, and I don't believe it's really one. There's really one thing that's causing a problem. There's always a complex of some site conditions. There's some maybe site changes, age of trees, species of trees, disease-related problems that all vary with changes of the environment, changes with the weather that we have from year to year. So when you look at that and that famous question of what's wrong with my trees, my spruce trees are always a big and a common one because they're so prevalent in our area and used as a main shelter belt planting that, hey, my needles are browning up. What's the problem? Well, there's so many different things that can cause that. So it is a complex trying to decipher what the problem really is. The idea of shelter belts and the proposed plantings and the design and everything, I think is exactly what we need to do and what we need to see out there. We have an aging and over mature group of shelter belts in a lot of our region that are they're fizzling out. They're planted and that skip the evolutionary type of process where trees move into regions all by themselves. And here we settle, turn of the century, and plant trees where we think they should be. So we're trying to manipulate what should be in our world. And of course, that doesn't mean that the trees are always going to last or even live in some of the conditions that we choose. So the planting designs for shelter belts as proposed and presented by Blair there makes good logic about what it is that we should be trying to do to mimic Mother Nature, staggering plant heights, mature plant heights, multiple rows to try and benefit us from a windbreak and a snow control situation. But at the same time, we're also diversifying the entire grove and planting more species that complement each other. And if you have a mixed species of trees, you have an insect or disease problem. It's not something that's going to come in and wipe out, a typical monoculture planting. So in that, I guess I see maybe if they look at it, 3 different categories of problems out there. You get biological, environmental, and mechanical. Any one of those, and I'm sorry, I'm going to stop myself there. It's like we do a lot of residential tree maintenance outside of farmyards and rural properties. So some of this kind of spins over into smaller residential properties as well. But so with that being said, mechanical injuries are not always noticed, I guess, but they're certainly the easiest one to pick on and easiest one for us to avoid. So as Blair was talking about, care around those shelter belts and not being a big fan of tilling in between the rows is exactly that. There's some of the damages that we're doing by getting close to make the job easier to ensure success, but also keep weed control as efficient as possible. We can do a lot of damage for roots, to trunks of trees, broken branches, and of course that always brings in a new host of all kinds of other conditions and problems. Not necessarily immediately, but it starts to create another another thing that the trees have to deal with. So with his pictures of mulching around the trees is excellent. It's always a way to, I dub it loosely as the no mow zone. You know, again, going to a residential type of setting, if you create a no mow zone or even a no go zone in that critical root zone, you automatically set yourself up a better chance of success and not have mechanical injuries around the trees, not removing soil to create drought kind of problems, allowing areas for organic mulches to be used to help reduce the water stresses. So, you know, it's a combination of things, and one ties with the next for sure. Beyond, well, the mechanical side of it, I guess there's also companion planting type of tactics I could use, where other tree species, or sorry, shrub and tree species could be used, considering their genetics and what they would actually grow to be. So say a typical transplant option in a front yard would be junipers around a shade tree. And of course that keeps the weeds at bay. It keeps some of the moisture down or in the soil. It keeps the need to be doing maintenance around the base of the tree to a minimum. So you reduce that risk of injury. So there's those kinds of things you could consider as well. The from the environmental side of it, well, we know that there's not a whole bunch of things that we can necessarily change about the environment, but we certainly have to pay attention to what it's telling us. And if we have a wet year or if we have a dry year, entirely and totally beyond our control. But what we do have control of is the site and the species selection and what it is that's going to work, and the variances on a site. Slight little low areas, pay attention to the drainage, and even soil checks. If you're suspicious of an area that's holding moisture a little bit more than some of the others, the grasses around there is growing a little bit better, then you might want to consider tree species that are going to tolerate the collection of water a bit more, like willows and poplars. Keep your spruce trees away from that, keep pine away from that. And maybe even as time has gone on, the water table has changed and some of those things are a new problem and a new hurdle that you have to clear. So with the replanting side of it, and nobody likes to see the big gaps and holes that can occur in shelter belts, or, you know, even if it's a single tree in the front yard, but there's a reason for it. There's something to be said for digging into understand exactly why the tree has died and what it is that you can do to set yourself up for better success. So it doesn't mean that, you know, if you have a tree that's died, a spruce tree, say, that we should be stuffing another spruce tree back in the same spot. There's maybe more to it than just the tree dying. So those, yeah, the environmental conditions, too hot, too dry, there's things that we kind of have to understand and try and work around, as opposed to pointing the finger at the bugs and the leaf diseases. Lots of those things. I'm getting ahead of myself. So mechanical troubles, environmental problems, environmental challenges, and then biological disorders that we can find on trees. And some of those are often just an indication of what the overall health and the state of the tree might be. It's always survival of the fittest. And when we have an over populated single tree species, it's only realistic to expect that we're going to have more chance of disease and more chance of insects that focus on those specific host trees. So how do we break that cycle? Certainly some of those things, and maybe all of them, are chemically treatable. But again, going back to planning and succession planning about what you can do to have a better grouping of trees that provide all the shelter, all the benefits that we have heard earlier, and all the things that we desire about them, and the things that we need. If we can diversify the species, you'll automatically see less of those problems. I'll bring up the forest tent caterpillar years. It wasn't any more than probably 3-4 years ago that we have certainly had our share of those. And of course, they like to feed on trembling aspen. And when you take a look in the Alberta prairies, well, of course, they're going to have population booms with tent caterpillars. They're major food source across the whole province and into Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And of course, it's not just the aspens, but it's a good example of how they can just ramp up the population just because of availability for food. So not like we're going to turn back the clock against the aspen forest and the way that that cycle and the process happens, but it's just used as a bit of an example. This year in particular, I've been seeing a lot of browning up of conifers, not just specific to pines or spruce. Excuse me, sorry. And that's a more of an environmental related issue. Cold dry. The amount of moisture that we didn't get to finish the year last year had a real detrimental effect on a lot of spruce, a lot of pine, a lot of cedars, a lot of junipers out there. And they can only give so much. So with the cold winter that we had on top of it, it just actually burned the needles out. And maybe those will come back if the twigs are still alive. The buds may still flush and come out, but the damage is something that can be confused with other things. So you get in, really look at the bigger picture of what we see for what's happening in the cycle of 1 year to the next for the trees. On top of that, there could be some confusion with the amount of needle cast disease, which is a fungal problem on the spruce needles that we've seen increasing occurrence over the past couple of years. And they look real similar, but certainly two different causes there for needle loss on the spruce. Trying to squeeze in as much as I can here. Lose my train of thought. But those are probably some of the biggest things I've seen in this, even just the beginning months of this year. And we get lots of phone calls regarding those in particular. Your Did I lose everybody? Nope, I guess I'm still there. Yeah, diversification. I'll go back to that. Planting new and different trees to improve the health of the entire stand. And some of those ideas go back to forest management practices. The idea of even going in thinning and culling the herd, so to speak. We have problems with a specific tree species. It might not be that they're bad trees, but if they're too much of it, we need to be able to go and identify and pull those trees, start planting some different species, and create diversity within those old shelter belts. I'd like to touch a little bit on a couple of things that Blair said there too about the style or the design of the shelter belts to be a ramp and not a wall. And to take that a little bit further, we have seen problems where there's a little bit more or a little less thought given it to some of the tree species planted in the single rows or even just double rows of say poplar, spruce. And because of that lack of the ramp style plantings, wind, thunderstorms come in and they can be pretty damaging on rows of trees. So you put a lot of years, a lot of time in, a lot of dollars, a lot of effort into a crop of trees, so to speak, that can be pretty devastated when the weather conditions are right as well. So it goes beyond just accepting that what you have as shelter belts and windrows as good because, hey, it's spring and they're starting to leaf out and what else do I do? They are maybe halfway through their life cycle. So what's there for the road down the road and what's there to protect them even in the short term to help them live as long as they possibly can. Giving up a little bit more space is sometimes needed and necessary, but every bit of wind direction and redirection what you could do, you'll help set your shelter belts up for a longer stretch. And he also touched on the idea of ash trees and the reluctance maybe to use ash because of some of the boring insect problems that are starting to move through the country. And we don't have evidence of those things right now, which is good, but I also would agree with him. I wouldn't necessarily shy away from planting them and considering planting them, even if they're used as a bit of a temporary planting, so to speak, but to help some of the other tree species establish and get that grove going. And even if there is the intention and the design that they may not be there for an extended period of time, and they are possibly and intentionally culled down the road is for the better sake or the better good of the entire grove. And I think one other thing I'd like to touch on there with Blair's conversation about the water. Watering is always a question when it comes to any new trees or any old trees. Now, how much do I water? How much water should there be? Most tree species, yes, they don't like stand-in water for any length of time. And it's hard to know sometimes exactly what's below the surface, but a quick dig with a shovel for your new trees or even old, there's always something to be said for getting your hands in the soil and knowing exactly what you have there. We got lots of rain, that's great, but how much has the soil actually absorbed and is it really lingering? A test dig every once in a while certainly goes a long way. We had a really snowy, icy winter and everything. There's an abundance of it, but last fall there really wasn't any moisture. So as the spring melt came, everything has soaked into the ground so quickly. And I think a lot of people would probably be surprised how dry the soil is, even out there right now. So don't get misled by the idea that there's maybe enough moisture for the trees. Water retention is always a bit of a difficult one, but use of mulches around the trees help retain the soil moisture longer. A little bit hard to come by sometimes, but like Blair said, there's straw options for sure, chips, bark mulches, anything organic is going to help retain some of that moisture longer and actually help the soil building process as well. And as they decay, you improve the soil porosity, you improve the soil ability to work, and the trees benefits, and of course not just the trees but the future trees. And it will also help with natural succession. So we try and create what it is that we want, but at the same time it could open up the opportunity for the natural succession to happen. And we've probably all seen areas primarily along the north sides of shelter belt rows and along the ditches and stuff, where it's a little cooler on the north side. The needles and cones and stuff have been gathering for a lot of years. The direct heat and sun's rays aren't getting there, but that's exactly where you find all the new seedlings growing. So there's a lot to be learned from that too. Digging those guys up and putting them out in the blazing hot sun is not always necessarily going to work the best for all cases and scenarios. But you know, to look around and see what's happening in your yard. And he mentioned that as well. You know, you wondered what's working at the neighbor's place and why is it working, and what's the differences? What do we see? How can I double that or double down on that and recreate it in my yard, in my property? And there's a lot to be learned that way, looking around instead of just digging in and working hard and planting trees. You can see a lot from what's happening right on your doorstep. And I think that's about what I'd like to add to Blair's presentation there, and grow and build off of that.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Lloyd, for that. Again, there was a lot of things to think about there, and a lot of you know, I liked how you dovetailed into, you know, the things that Blair had mentioned, and you know that the common themes of that are around you know, planning and more planning, and not just sticking things in the ground, and actually understanding what's going on and thinking through some of those things a little more. So I just wanted to say that Kathy had put it in the chat, but in case people haven't seen that, in the County of Vermilion River, we do have a tree planter and a plastic mulch applicator that are available to borrow for county residents, if you're interested in those things. And the two programs, well, the one program that we have in the county for agricultural producers is the ALICE program. And so we can, you know, help with funding and technical resources and that sort of thing as well. We've done lots of projects with Oz in the past, and so we can continue to work with them. And so, you know, we can also be a resource, whether that's myself or from the ALICE program, or, you know, Kathy can be a resource as well. And we don't have a green acreages program, but for acreage owners that are on this webinar, there is a program through the Land Stewardship Center called the Green Acreages Program. I do have some resources with that as well, if you're interested in looking at that, and they do have some funding potentially available there. So just so that stuff's out there, and if you have any further questions, you can get a hold of me for that. But yeah, I think that's all of those sorts of things. We have a couple questions in the chat, so we'll maybe start with those.
Yeah,
Did you?
yeah,
Yeah.
I can address the first couple there, and I'll leave the last one for Jeff. But
Sure.
yeah, definitely. You know, if you're on an acreage or even in a farmyard, whether it's you spraying or the neighbor. I mean, I've actually had to do insurance claim investigations for a couple of acreage owners in the past. And I think a lot of people tend to put up with it because their neighbors are doing it, or they own the land and they're renting it. They don't want to. It can cause a lot of hardship and relationship issues. But certainly one of the biggest risks is farm applied herbicides. And so I guess best thing is if you know the person, if it's yourself or your neighbor or a renter that's applying, have really good communication, I guess, and have them have the understanding to basically have spray when there's a wind direction that's most suitable. And possibly the best option, because it's not always easier for you to move in and, not necessarily have enough room to move your planting in if your space is restricted, within reason you can, but the best thing is maybe for the farmer to consider not getting as close. And the other option too is like, I know a lot of people, I think, well, love or hate them, Carriganas tend to be on the prairies. A lot of the older farmsteads, those were the outside tree row, and they actually, I mean, they will take some they will take a little bit of heat as far as Roundup and that kind of thing. But it's really interesting how the wind turbulence, even a seemingly calm day, depending on the type of sprayer that a farmer has, the droplet size, something can just sort of just settle in. It doesn't even have to be big wind. It can just settle in, and it's really the dynamics of that is quite interesting. So, and obviously the smaller the trees, the bigger the impact. Like if it's new planting, and you get a good whiff of or a good dose of spray coming through, it's going to be devastating. But and it can be fairly devastating even on like one investigation I did was mostly 20-year-old trees, and it killed the 200 trees dead. And was varying parts of the shelter belt, and that's tough to come back from. It's you're talking tens of thousands of dollars of damage, and the big thing is that most people don't realize they can go for insurance on these things. Like farmers are generally, most of them have insurance coverage for this kind of thing. I mean, it doesn't make for great neighbors maybe, but if you invested 20, 30, 40,000 dollars into your trees, and then you're a few years down the road, you've got something that's a 10 or 20-year-old shelter belt, and they come along and one application takes out half your shelter belt. That's pretty devastating. And even putting caliper trees back in, it's still you've lost 10, 15, 20 years of growth, and it's just hard to come back from. So I guess the short of it is, I'd say have good communication, and if possible, put something that may be sacrificial a little bit on the edge or something that, but again, that turbulence, it can roll over the shelter belt even, and I've seen it where it's not really hit the outside trees, and it's just kind of gotten into the inside, and it's taken out more of the ornamental ones. It's just kind of every situation different. So and then I guess the other question was to do with pesticide application, herbicide application. Now this can be really dangerous, and that's why Lloyd alluded to that too. Use mulches so that you don't have to get right near the base, especially on young trees. But I've heard of people that have, I put a 20-liter pail over every little seedling and I sprayed, but what they didn't realize is that they sprayed the pail, but then in the process of going from one tree to the other, they're actually contaminating, and especially Roundup, if you get it drip it onto the leaves of the next tree you move to. There's really not a really safe way to do that. I wouldn't advise applying any herbicides anywhere close to your trees. On the edges maybe of if you're doing plastic mulch or any kind of bio mulch. But one thing with conifers is that you can, like, once they wax over, or like sort of prepare themselves for winter, I mean, you have to use the right type of like the original original Roundup, not there's varying types of Roundup. There's some of them that I wouldn't recommend, but again, I would consult somebody before you tried it. But you can I wouldn't like overspray too much on the conifers, but in late August, early September, you could get a little bit on some of the conifers, and they won't I'm mainly talking white spruce, Colorado spruce. But if you're not confident with that, I wouldn't do it. But I know it can be done, but again, you need to know what you're doing and the timing. But long story short, I would say if you can avoid having to apply herbicides near the base of your trees, I wouldn't do it in the early years for sure.
Yeah.
Because translocating herbicide will, if you get it on the bark, you don't have to get it on the leaves. If we get it on the bark, it's going to you get enough of it on there, it's going to translocate down, and you're going to end up killing the tree or compromising it severely.
Nope, totally agree with you there, Blair. It's I mean, it's on label for some glyphosate products, but yeah, it's something that's done best sparingly after they've set bud.
Right.
Cool. So yeah, to follow up on will the 2 billion tree support tree purchase on on nut trees or fruit trees or any production proposed plantation? I think that's a kind of a product by product question. So like if someone just wanted to set up, for instance, an apple orchard, I don't think that's something it would cover, but like if they're looking at setting up, large portions of like fruit bearing shrubs, like that are especially native species like Saskatoons, I think that's something that would be fairly eligible. With the program does have a minimum number of trees too. So, and then, yeah, unfortunately, really there's not really a lot of nut producing species in this part of the world or things that can survive. But yeah, we could work to try and incorporate in planting plans, yeah, fruit bearing trees and shrubs and nuts where possible. But yeah, just something that's specifically a plantation, especially like an apple orchard or something that would have, there would be some scrutiny, is that we do like the way our program runs with the federal government is that they have their criteria. We put how our program is going to be run, and provided we run it with that, we can automatically approve funding. But they do review our planting plans, and so yeah, if something was just like an apple tree orchard, it kind of depends. So that's where, yeah, I would I'll just put my contact again in the chat, and that's my Todd's email. So any questions on program eligibility? Oh, that's a direct message. Sorry. On yeah, so yeah, on program eligibility, just yeah, feel free to reach out to me. So it's, anyways, the short answer is sort of.
All right, so that's all the questions we have in the chat. If anybody has a question that they'd like to ask directly, we do have a few minutes here. So if if there's something else you'd like to ask, you can feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask. Look like there's any other questions. Oh, let's see. We do have a question about the YouTube channel. So that would be on the County of Vermilion River YouTube channel you can access through the website, I believe, unless Kathy has a different has more information on that. But yeah, we'll post that in the near future on that. And like I said, you can always contact Kathy or myself at the county if you have further questions about resources. We can also, we may have some answers, but we can also connect you to some to Oz and other organizations as well, and help with the programs that we have available. And yeah, certainly if you have any questions, or you're looking for some to do some maintenance on the trees that you have, Lloyd is a great resource there too, and can help with lots of those things. So I don't think we have anything else. So yeah, it looks like we're good for questions. So again, I'd like to thank Blair and Jeff and Lloyd for taking some time to share that information with us. Great presentations and lots of great information. And thank you to everybody that took some time this evening to learn more about tree planting. Yeah, so we will Yeah, so the link for the YouTube will post on the county website, but Kathy will also send it out by email to the people that registered. So yeah, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we hope you enjoyed this presentation, and have a good night, everyone.